Thank you. Yes, Eurodad is a network of 46 anti-poverty NGOs in 20 European countries, but we're also part of a global set of networks with sister networks in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And I wanted to offer three principles I think ought to guide your work in reforming the DAC. But before I do, I just wanted to say something about why it's so incredibly important, because, as Eric says, you're setting aid rules, and these rules have enormous impacts. And I can give you a good example and a bad example. A good example is your predecessors, who came up with the term official development assistance, did us all a great favor, because that encapsulates some very important principles, in particular that the money should be about development of developing countries. And then a bad example, I think your predecessors who set the rules on refugee costs have allowed quite a scandalous situation to develop, where next year $10 billion is expected to be counted of ODA as refugee costs, even though we all know this is not about the development of developing countries. And that in no way says that we shouldn't be spending money. Of course we should be spending money on refugees, but it clearly isn't ODA. So the decisions you make have a lot of impact, and they have a lot of impact, I think, on the millions and the hundreds of millions of poor people that we all care so much about, and we should have them in mind. And they also have a lot of impact for the supporters of ODA and the credibility of ODA amongst the public in OECD countries. And some of you have been the recipients of a petition with over 70,000 signatures now calling on you all to focus on the purpose of ODA in these discussions. So, bearing those points in mind, I wanted to offer three principles that, as a group of what I see as very powerful people, might like to bear in mind as you discuss how to reform your group. And they are legitimacy, transparency, and accountability, and just some very small, simple examples for each one. So legitimacy, I think it's absolutely right that if you're making rules that affect hundreds of millions of people in developing countries, they ought to be at the table. So, of course, that brings into question how do you do that? And, of course, that was part of the reason the global partnership was set up. So I think strengthening that and thinking about how to use that is important. And, of course, one obvious problem, I think, with the global partnership was that funding fell when it was created. So it has far fewer resources than its predecessors did. And so maybe you want to think about how to fund these the participation of other countries and other stakeholders. Second, on transparency, not always the biggest fan of the World Bank Group, but their transparency policy has a very important principle at the heart of it, which is that all documents, everything should be disclosed, everything should be available, except for a very limited number of exceptions which have to be justified. Whereas I see the way the DAC works at the moment is the other way around, and everything is presumed to be secret until it's released. So I think turning that round would be a really important step forward. And finally, on accountability, it's very hard for people outside this room to know how we can contribute to your discussions. And so having clear consultation policies that allow people to know how they can contribute, what the timeline is, and how their inputs will be received would be really helpful. Thanks once again for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.